Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear participants and dear guests. Today is January the 13th, 2022. It's 11 o'clock Moscow time. I would like to declare the meeting of the Dissertation Council on the thesis by Gorbunova Daria Alexandrovna, applicant applying to the scientific degree of the candidate in philological sciences, major 595, Russian language, the languages of peoples of Russia, on the topic Pragmatic markers in Russian spoken spontaneous speech. Let us consider the meeting of the Dissertation Council open. By the order of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg State University, Ignatov Alexander Valentinovich, from the 29th of October 2021, number 10598/1, I, Ryekova Maria Viktorovna, Doctor of Philological Sciences, Associate Professor, Professor of the Department of Russian Language of St. Petersburg State University, was appointed the chairperson of the dissertational meeting. The same order established the following members of the Dissertation Council: Zinovьeva Yelena Innocentivna, Doctor of Philological Sciences, Professor of the Department of Russian Language as Foreign Language; Vasilieva Galina Mikhailovna, Doctor of Philological Sciences, Professor of the Department of Intercultural Communication of the Russian Herzen University. In the remote access mode, the following members take part: Isses Oksana Sergeyevna, Doctor of Philological Sciences, Professor, the head of the Department of Theoretical and Applied Linguistics, the Dean of the Faculty of Philology and Media Communication of Omsk State University of Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky; Cherkulov Vyacheslav Isayevich, Doctor of Philological Sciences, Professor, the head of the Department of Russian Language of Donetsk National University. Dear colleagues in the remote access mode, can you see and hear us? Yes, everything is fine. The scientific advisor, the Doctor of Philological Sciences, Professor of the Department of Russian Language, Paktanova Beglaran Natalia Viktorovna, is present. Dear colleagues, especially those in the remote access mode, please turn off your microphones, but please don't forget to turn them on when you're given the floor. I'd like to announce that audiovisual recording is being carried out, as well as live broadcasts on St. Petersburg State University website. Also, simultaneous interpretation is being carried out. On the screen of live broadcast, viewers can see the email where all listeners can send their questions to the applicant or express their opinions related to the content of the thesis and the presentation of the applicant, the current scientific discussion, and thus take part in the discussion itself. The questions will be directed to me by the technical staff, and I will voice them during the discussion. The questions are to be directly related to the presentation of the applicant and the content of the thesis. The questions cannot be anonymous. It's mandatory to indicate name, surname, and the job position. The questions not related to the scientific discussion, the text of the thesis, and the appraisal of the thesis, as well as anonymous questions, will not be voiced. In accordance with the order of awarding scientific degree of Candidate of Science and scientific degree of Doctor of Science at St. Petersburg State University, in accordance with the local acts of St. Petersburg State University, the meeting of the Dissertation Council is considered valid if no more than 2/3 of the approved membership of the Dissertation Council take part in it, but no less than 4 people. In our case, the Dissertation Council consists of 5 people, and all 5 people are present, including 2 members in the remote access mode. Audiovisual contact is provided with all the members Thus we have quorum. I would like to ask the officer of the providing the activity of the Station Council, the curator of the defense, issue a turnout list. I would like to announce the regulations and the rules of the procedure of the Decision Council with the general duration of about 2 hours. First, a brief information by the chairperson about the applicant and the documents submitted by the applicant and their compliance with the rules. Answer to possible questions. About 5 minutes. 2. Brief presentation by the applicant about the major provisions of the defense. 3. Questions to the applicant strictly according to the presentation, no more than 2 minutes. Answers to the applicant, no more than 5 minutes in total. 5. Speech. Use of all the members of the Decision Council and rota with the appraisal of the thesis and the presentation by the applicant with the questions and remarks considering the thesis. About 10 minutes per speaker. Then the speech of the chairperson with the appraisal of the thesis, about 10 minutes. Answers of the applicant to all the questions and remarks, and we will discuss whether you will answer all the questions after all of them are voiced or after each speech of the member of the council. But in total, the answers take no more than 20 minutes. Open discussion. Those present at the defense will be allowed to take the floor and express their questions and recommendations to the applicant, strictly on the topic of the thesis, no more than 2 minutes per speaker. We would like to ask all those willing to take the floor to mark themselves in the turnout list and prior to speaking to voice their name, surname and job position. 9. We will voice the questions received during the live broadcast through the email. The written questions, which require more than 2 minutes to be voiced, will not be voiced. So please be concise. Answers of the applicant, no more than 2 minutes per question. The speech of the scientific advisor, Natalia Viktorovna, Bogdanova Beklaran, no more than 3 minutes. Next, the discussion by the members of the Decision Council prior to the open roll call of the results of the defense, during which the sound will be muted, if we need such a discussion. Then we'll proceed with open voting and the counting of votes by the chairperson with subsequent entry of the results in the minutes. Then we will decide on awarding or not awarding the scientific degree, and the final speech by the applicant will proceed. Do you have any questions to the order? Since there are no questions and objections, we will start implementing the order. First of all, please turn off the sound of your mobile phones. But I would like the colleagues who are in the remote access mode not to turn off your mobile phones, since their necessity to contact you might arise. So we start the meeting. A brief report. The thesis by Gorbunova, Daria Alexandrovna, applying for the scientific degree of the candidate of philological sciences, major 595 Russian languages of the people of Russia, on the topic pragmatic markers in Russian spoken spontaneous speech, correlation with speakers' psychotype, was taken for defense by the order from the 8th of October 2021, number 9653/1. Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova wrote the thesis on the basis of Pragmatic State University as a postgraduate student. Her scientific advisor is the Doctor of Philological Sciences, St. Petersburg State University, Bogdanova, Daria, and Natalia Viktorovna. The number of published works which reflect the main provisions of the thesis are 4. All 4 can be found in the publications indexed by the Ministry of the Education of Science of the Russian Federation. None publications indexed in the Web of Science and Scopus. All the documents submitted by the applicant correspond to the requirements of the State University and can be found in the attestation file of the applicant. The copies can also be found in the Dissertation Council. Prior to giving the floor to the applicant, I have a question to the members of the Dissertation Council. Do you have any general question to the applicant? Is there a need to announce the entire list of the documents provided for the defense? Oksana Sergeyevna, what do you think? No questions? Since there are no questions, then we are giving the floor to Alexandrovna Gorbunova. The floor is yours. Dear Chairman of the Dissertation Council, dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear colleagues and guests, you can see the topic of my work on the slide, and the purpose of the work was to research and describe the influence of individual and general psychological characteristics of a person on their everyday speech, based on the use of a number of pragmatic markers. The source of material for the study was the corpus of Russian oral spontaneous speech, one speech day, as well as specialized psychological tests taken by the informants of OSD, Eisen questionnaire and Freiburg multifactorial questionnaire. The working subcorpus include 270,383 tokens and 3,480 contexts. Pragmatic markers are considered units of oral discourse, the result of the apprendization process, with the weakened or absent referential meaning serving to perform various functions. The study is based on the function typology of pragmatic markers proposed by Natalia Viktorovna, Bogdanova, Daria. When collecting and annotating the data, this particular list of PM functions and singular codes for their designations were used. The aim of the thesis determined the psycholinguistic orientation of the linguistic description and determines the following tasks, which can be seen on the slide. To carry out a linguistic analysis, it was necessary to perform a number of preparatory actions. In particular, in order to obtain reliable results for psychological testing, we required a reliable method of rapid processing of the initial data for informants. It was decided to create a software that would allow to enter the data from the questionnaires, have access to all the data, and completely eliminate errors during the calculation. The development of software was focused on solving an applied psycholinguistic problem, that is, determining the psychotype of the informants of OSD based on the test they completed, and it was a necessary step in the conduct of the study. The program of the experiment was implemented in 2 versions for processing 2 different tests. That is the Eisenberg questionnaire and the Friedberg multifactorial questionnaire. Comparison of the result of the 2 tests on the scale introversion and extroversion revealed coincidences in 64.6 cases. All informants whose test result did not match the results of the 2 questionnaires were excluded from the final sampling. Only 42 informants turned out to be the most representative participants for further linguistic analysis. During the selection and annotation, 8 more informants had to be excluded. The final working subcorpus included the speech day of 34 informants, 24 extroverts and 10 introverts. After receiving the necessary information, it became necessary to clean and normalize the text state of the corpus. To carry out normalization, the following data were required. People CSV table containing 2 columns with informant's code, S code, and corresponding psychotype, P type. Translation of all letters and transcript to lowercase was carried out, removal of all decryption characters, automatic recognition and deletion of communication words, automatic counting of the informant's word, gluing the informant's code, their psychotype and remarks, filtering out replicas containing pragmatic markers, and manual markup of PM functional type replicas. The markup revealed polyfunctional PMs. 2 or 3 functions in the same context could be combined. During the calculations, that users were treated as 2 or more units. For example, the Pragmatic I don't know from the first context that you can see on screen, annotated as hesitative marker, was considered to be 3 users of PM. I don't know as hesitative, I don't know as distinctive marker, and I don't know as meta-communicative marker. In total, the final user subcorpus included and were analyzed 1,547 units from the speech of 34 informants, 10 introverts and 24 extroverts. The following 2 provisions are submitted for defense. The first, person is a time can be perceived through language, and not in the general sense, but with particular consideration of certain group of linguistic units, in our case, pragmatic markers. Second, according to the number of pragmatic markers in speech, one can identify a clear difference between psychological types. The third provision for defense, considering that different functional types of pragmatic markers, their types of usage, correlate with psychological characteristics and the psychotype of the speaker. The rank distribution of PM by psychotypes confirmed the hypothesis of a greater functional diversity of pragmatic markers in the speech of extroverts. Extroverts, more than introverts, use scene indicators and wrist-forming markers. This difference demonstrates the trend for extroverts to decorate their speech somehow. Introverts use hesitative markers mostly to give themselves time to think, while extroverts take advantage of the multifunctional nature of this type of marker, using them to add functional variety even to hesitatives in their speech, which can be seen in the following example. Introverts most often use metacommunicatives, you understand, to ensure the attention of the listeners, and extroverts, on the contrary, use metacommunicatives, listen, in order to seize the initiative and continue talking, which is exemplified in the slide. The final idea submitted for defense is the position that functional distribution of pragmatic markers, depending on the psychological type of the speakers, is uneven and is not a defining feature for predictive analysis of the psychotype. The most frequent in the speech of both types of speakers turned out to be hesitative and delimiting markers. However, the distribution was not uniform, as it might seem. As for introverts, the most frequent markers stood apart, and the share of other functional times of pragmatic markers in their speech was small. The results of this study were included in the dictionary monograph Pragmatic Markers of Russian Everyday Speech. Based on the use of subcorpus, more technically complex analysis from the technical standpoint can be performed, for example, using machine learning methods of background analysis with markup according to the types of speech. The results of the study are relevant for creating natural speech generation tool during the selection of personnel for the needs of linguistics and linguistic expertise, the development and improvement of systems of automatic processing, recognition and synthesis of speech, applied linguistics, and in linguodidactics. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm ready to answer your questions. Thank you, Daria Alexandrovna. First of all, I would like to ask the members of the Dissertation Council if they have any questions related to the presentation. None. There are no questions since we are well aware with the text of the thesis, so we can proceed with the discussion. That is, we can move to the speech of the members of the Dissertation Council with their reviews. Daria Alexandrovna, what do you prefer, to provide answers after each separate speech of the member of the Dissertation Council? I would like to answer all the questions at once after all the reviews are voiced. I think it's useful and convenient for everyone. All the reviews were published on the St. Petersburg State University website, so I offer the members of the Dissertation Council to voice only the key aspects and the key features of your reviews, since all the information can be found on the website. We did not receive any external reviews. Thus, we can proceed with voicing the reviews of the members of the Dissertation Council. I'd like to offer to start with those who are in the offline mode. I'd like to begin by saying that it is not the first defense headed by Natalia Viktorovna. I'd like to say this is a school of studying oral spontaneous speech, and this defense is within the framework of the scientific school. The expediency of the research is that the author is trying to determine the link between the extrovertial and introvertial type of the personality based on the frequency of use of pragmatisms or pragmatic markers. The novelty is based on interdisciplinary approach to the analysis of the corpus of language material. Psychological methods were used, that is, special questionnaires to identify the type of personality, the use of statistical methods or with software which accelerate the process of data processing, which allow the applicant to calculate the frequency of the usage of the units and linguistic methods. The thesis itself is well structured and logical. The definitions of the key notions, pragmatic markers, pragmaticalization, grammaticalization. The author describes the model of the personality, the key features of the personality, which are important for this particular research. The definitions of extrovert and introvert are provided. The technical base is fully covered, and statistical work is profound, as well as uses subcorpus. The functional types of pragmatic markers are identified and arranged, and their distribution in the speech of introverts and extroverts. The author concludes that introverts use more pragmatisms than extroverts, but the former use a much wider range of such marker. The author demonstrates a broad scientific knowledge, awareness with the key works, and the list of reference material includes 220 books, 89 in English. The author refers to the scientific literature with grounding the choice. One of the major advantages of the thesis is the interpretation of the obtained results provided by the applicant. That is, the description of the differences that were identified, and the identification of psychological basis for the use of pragmatisms in this speech of introverts and extroverts, and explanation of the causes of using the same markers. The scientific style is rather high, and there are no typos, which is very pleasant. I'd like to move to certain remarks which are of a discursive nature. The first remark is related to the introduction part of the thesis, to some of the wordings. Page 8, the aim of the research is the following. The aim of the research is the search and the description of correlation between pragmatic markers of different functional types and individual and general psychological characteristics of the person in the everyday speech. Well, the individual characteristics of the person speech are not discussed in the word, and if we talk about psychological characteristics, the applicant, I suppose, focuses only on extroversion and introversion. Or, in my opinion, the interpretation of the results obtained is lacking. Page 10 sees the list of the methods. Deductive, description, mathematical. Where do we have the linguistic method, the method of discursive analysis, contextual method, and method of semantic analysis? These methods are absent. The hypothesis is not present in the thesis. On page 48, we can see the following. The current thesis attempts to analyze two psycholinguistic hypotheses. The first, thesis that the personality and its psychological type is formed linguistically. And secondly, the personality's type can be perceived through the language, not in general, but in particular cases when analyzing special group of language units. This wording is a little bit ambiguous, and it does not correspond to the content of the work. The volumes of the chapters are not always proportionate, and the conclusion includes quotations, which is not suitable for this part of the work. My questions are the following. The final user subcorpus used and analyzed 1,547 pragmatisms from the context of the speech of 34 informants. How many contexts were analyzed, and is the material representative enough for general conclusions? I base my question, or this question arose, because of what the author said, for example, on page 107. A small number of contexts does not allow to consider marker xenodeterminants to the functional type, which is typical to extroverts. The second question. Don't you think that the exclusion of ambiverts makes the experiment not so reliable? 3. On page 97, we can see very often the introvert can use the starter marker in the following way: to put it in the very beginning, preparing thus to the long speech. On page 98, the conclusions are based on the usage of different markers. Introverts use more delineative markers, for example, marker. So, use them to help and continue the process of speech. And extroverts use the markers, yes, help themselves and try to understand the reaction of the interlocutor. The articles published following the research are 16, 4 published in the publications recommended by the Ministry of Education. The thesis is the work which contains new scientific results, which is expedient for future scientific analysis of the topic. The conclusion, the thesis by Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova on the topic Pragmatic markers in Russian-spoken spontaneous speech corresponds to the requirements on awarding the scientific degrees of Candidate of Sciences, and the applicant deserves being awarded the scientific degree of Candidate of Sciences, Major 595, Russian languages of the peoples of Russia. Elena Nikitimna, thank you very much. Then we move on to the net review. Galina Mikhailovna, the floor is yours. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I'd like to say that my positive perception of the thesis coincided with the previous speaker in most parts, so I'm not going to repeat the same ideas. What I want to know is that the thesis of Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova is dedicated to a very interesting and courageous hypothesis linking to the psychotype of the speaker. And this hypothesis is related to different sciences and areas. That's why this research is expedient and novel. Well, I can see how I follow the previous speaker. We see that the theoretical base is substantial, and this deserves a high evaluation, and deep multilateral analysis is provided and conducted. The work itself is rather detailed. Substantial analysis was being carried out, not only in the modern concept, but in the diachronic aspect as well. And the expediency of using the method of psycholinguistic research and phenomenon of psychotype of the personality of a spoken spontaneous speech. The expediency of the number of quantitative methods were determined in order to identify the material, as well as psychological tests. I would like to especially note the high reliability of the results obtained by the author that can be found in the research part of the thesis. The volume of the material researched is substantial, as well as the modern and scientific methods of processing and classifying the material. I would like to point out the systematic approach and visual aids. Thank you for such logical work. Based on the quality data about the frequency of PM, the hypothesis of considering the correlation between the number of pragmatisms and the introverts and the extrovert type of the psychotype of people. Introverts use the pragmatic markers twice as much as extroverts, which defines the novelty of the thesis, since it creates the mechanism of analysis of pragmatic markers in the spoken spontaneous speech received in natural conditions, which allow to find the correlation for the usage of this unit with the psychotype of the speaker. The practical value of the research is also important, and I believe that the aim of the work is achieved. The defendant identified the correlations and described them, and the respective aims were also reached. I would also like to say that the structure of the work is logical and the scientific style of high quality. The list of reference material is substantial, including the works in 4 languages. And these are very important characteristics of the work. I would also like to say that there are many works published, in particular 16, and the quality of them. The main content of the work and the provisions for defense arise no objections. I have a number of questions which have a form of discussion which might be viewed as linked to the future prospects of the research. Agreeing with the author of the thesis that in our real life there are not so many pure extroverts and introverts, and taking into consideration the results of the testing of ambiverts who were not included in the scope of analysis. Well, I have no negative perception of that, since it was out of scope of the work. I would like to ask if the applicant is planning to research the qualifications and specifications of the spoken spontaneous speech. So will their speech be neutral as well as psychotype, or we can find the linguistic correlations of this type of language users? Second, take into account that people with different demographic characteristics can be extrovert and introverts. My question is the following. Can the age of the introvert and extrovert influence the quality and the type of the used pragmatic markers? And since the pragmatic markers of the speech of introverts and extroverts identified in the thesis are perceived to be very important to perceive the image of the speaking person, I find it interesting whether employers should choose employees when choosing the employees for the position where they will be required to speak a lot, take their psychotype into consideration. Well, these questions are not related to any negative aspects of the dissertation. And the final conclusion is the thesis pragmatic markers in the Russian spoken spontaneous speech, correlation with speaker's psychotype, correspond to the main provisions established by the order from the 19th of November 2021, number 11181/1, on the requirements of awarding scientific degrees and suitability to university. The applicant, Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova, deserves being awarded the scientific degree of the candidate of philological sciences, major 959, Russian languages, people of Russia. Points 9 and 11 were not violated. Do we need to say 5.9 point? No, I think we can omit that. Thank you very much. And we'd like to give the floor to Oksana Sergeyevna Isers to voice her review.
Я хочу сказать...
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Daria Alexandrovna set an ambitious goal in her research paper. And at the contemporary level, it was solved only in fragmentary type, to identify the specifications of speech which are not controlled on the conscious level. And the material used by Daria Alexandrovna allowed to solve this problem. This is why we can see the theoretical value and applicability of the research. But let's address the work itself. The work itself is original and is based on the hypothesis, which played an important part. It's original because of a number of factors. The author talks not only about linguistic but also about psycholinguistic analysis of the substantial corpus material. The object of analysis are pragmatic markers, the linguistic status of which in colloquialistics is not clear yet, and this is a discursive issue. And finally, the novelty of the topic is linked to the interdisciplinary type of the research, which is conducted based on a number of modern linguistic areas. A very important factor when appraising the work is linked to the idea that Daria Alexandrovna represents the team of philologists from Universitetskaya University, which is well known in Russia and abroad, and she has long been a part of this team. She was related to the publishing of the results of the research, communicative studies, that is. This is the work that was being conducted over several years. I know that Daria Alexandrovna has been working with Natalia Viktorovna for a long time, and that influenced the approach to the thesis and the setting of goal. We can see that Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova knows the current methods of linguistic science and of the interdisciplinary methods. She uses the discursive ideas in the modern context of linguistics, paying special attention to the studies of the spoken spontaneous speech and the achievements in lingua pragmatics. Another positive aspect of the thesis is that a wide overview of the works in Russian and in English is being provided. Many works are cited in the author's translation. That is, that the recent studies are being introduced into scientific use by the author of the thesis. The aim of each of the 4 chapters reflects a sequence of the research procedures to identify the correlation between the pragmatic markers of different functional types and psychological characteristics of person. As was already stated in the first 3 chapters, and there are 4 of them in total, the overview of the main approaches, scientific approaches, are delineated, which influenced the choice of corpus data. And for the use in the applied part of the thesis, such structure is expedient. So the first chapter is dedicated to the main aspects, the second to psycholinguistic aspect of oral speech, and the third chapter shows the grounds for the usage of software. And the fourth research chapter has the extensive analysis of the usage of pragmatic markers by extroverts and introverts, and we can see the data and their correlations. I'd like to note that despite the fact that this chapter is not the largest part of the research, I would say that the dictionary monography would also be considered the result of the research, since it provides a practical approach to the results obtained on the extensive corpus of the data. Based on the corpus One Speech Day, no such research was previously conducted, so the novelty is obvious, and the theoretical importance of the thesis is also clear. If we talk about practical value of the research, I suppose that it is primarily linked to the use of the method described in the thesis to conduct the linguistic analysis of the text and large corpus of data, and some aims might be motivated by social request. In particular, we can talk about linguistic expertise. Today, the expert appraisals, considering the genuine authorship, are expedient, especially when we talk about online publications, when the author uses a nickname or is anonymous. The results might be used for in-depth studies of Russian language as a foreign language, to master the spoken speech, spontaneous speech, and I believe that quite naturally these ideas will be used in university courses on psycholinguistics and communication and corpus linguistics, and the dictionary monography of pragmatic markers of Russian spontaneous speech will serve a useful form to provide work in these areas. The publications have already been voiced, and the number of them is substantial. Nevertheless, there are certain provisions that require certain comments and remarks, and I would like to ask a couple of questions. First of all, I'd like to specify what the author means by saying individual and general psychological characteristic of a person. General psychological characteristics are taken into account, but what is meant when saying individual characteristics and how do they correlate with the spoken spontaneous speech is not quite clear. The second question is linked to the topic and is linked to the future prospects. Is it realistic to identify certain linguistic correlatives between spoken and written speech of people with different temperament? The theory of the personality, which has been actively developing since 50s, starting with the Eisen questionnaire. There are different approaches, and I'd like to ask Daria what are the perspective of using the material and data that she identified. As for Eisen questionnaire, which is one of the two tests that was filled by the informants, during the project One Speech Day, I'd like to find out, if we take into account the second multifactorial questionnaire, introverts and extroverts are only one scale and there are 11 more factors. Is it possible to consider those 11 factors based on the information from One Speech Day? And the second idea follows the first one. When identifying the correlation psychotypes and pragmatic markers, the author used the theory of types of personality by Eisen. But in the earlier research in 1947, based on two independent parameters, introversion and extroversion, neuroticism and stability, Eisen identified not two but four types of personality: stable introvert, neurotic introvert, stable extrovert, neurotic extrovert. We can all see these types of personality in our everyday communications. And in 70s, another type of considering personality, psychotism, and the power of superego. Probably this was not used when working with the informants of One Speech Day. Eisen stressed that the description of the qualities can be considered only extreme points, and the majority of people find themselves in the medial position. How does the author estimate the validity of the results obtained? Can we expect the distribution of these markers if we use additional parameters? And the final question is the following. The conclusion states that the results are key to choose the staff by employers. I wouldn't like to be a person who is appraised in accordance with the usage of pragmatic markers. I understand that it might be an instrument for an HR specialist, but my question is, should I mind the use of pragmatic markers in my speech? I minimize them, for example, if I want to get the position where soft skills in communication are required, and I am supposed to be an extrovert. How can it be practically implemented? Thus, the reviewed thesis by Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova is independent, finalized. Well, if we talk about the finality of the issue, well, there is no end to progress and perfection. Interesting and non-trivial scientific research paper where all the goals are met. And the thesis by Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova on the topic pragmatic markers in Russian spoken spontaneous speech, correlation with speaker's psychotype, correspond to the main requirements by order from 1911-2021, number 11181/1, on the procedure of awarding scientific degrees at Pragmatic State University. And Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova deserves being awarded the scientific degree of the candidate of philological sciences, major 595, Russian language, the languages of the peoples of Russia. Points 9 and 11 of the above-mentioned order were not violated by the applicant. Thank you, Oksana Sergeyevna, for your interesting questions. And we give the floor to Vyacheslav Isayevich Trykulov to voice his review. Vyacheslav Isayevich, the floor is yours. Thank you, dear colleagues. I really like to work in such a mode because all I could say was previously voiced by me. So what remains to me is to voice some of the remarks that are a little bit different from those of my colleagues. I really liked the work by Daria Alexandrovna. Since this is a thesis, the conclusions are based on the live and active use of the speech, and the work combines two types of the research: colloquialist, which is linked with the school of Natalia Viktorovna, and psycholinguistic. And this attempt to combine operative, spontaneous speech and psychological characteristics of personality and psycholinguistic characteristics of personality is rather novel. I won't talk about the goals and the aims, the novelty and theoretical novelty of the work. I will disagree with only two aspects, I suppose, that my colleagues mentioned: a certain disbalance of text, because I believe that it was highly logical, and the third chapter is not the overview, rather, but is a description of the technology of the research, which was extremely interesting, but maybe not always clear. As for provisions for defense, are identified, and their research is well grounded. When the author describes the aims and goals of the paper, the author says that one of the goals was to get to know the overview of the reference material. Well, in my opinion, this overview should precede the research. And if we talk about the thesis, well, it is always a part of the thesis, so it's not necessary to identify it as a separate goal. Well, scientific novelty has already been mentioned, and its theoretical importance and practical applicability are beyond doubt. The paper consists of the introduction, 3 theoretical chapters and a research chapter, and 4 appendices, which I find most important, most interesting, since they showed the basis for theoretical conclusions of the author. So I'm not going to repeat what has already been mentioned, and I would like to move on to the comments and questions that arose. And I would like to say that the overall perception is highly positive. So these are the questions that arose. Maybe they are important for me, for my personal understanding of the topic discussed, and for my future research. The first: when the author talks about the role of pragmatization in organization, the oral discourse, well, I'll call it discourse. It would be expedient to identify what is defined by discourse. It could help me to understand what pragmatization means. The participation of pragmatism and discursive markers in organizing the discourse as a text, or text that can be found in the communication situation, according to Gorosik, or as speech stemmed in life, according to Arutunov. In each case, the reaction of the speaker to the spoken discourse will be different. In the first, it will be a reaction to the text; in the second, to the text and the communicative situation, and so forth. Second, In my opinion, the method of identifying why a certain unit belongs to a certain type of pragmatic markers was lacking, and also the information considering why a specific unit is a pragmatic marker as well was lacking, in my opinion. The author herself makes that certain markers were used in order to substitute somebody else's speech, thus taking the semantics of the listed objects. 3. I don't quite understand the idea that the speech is the most natural and a common form of the language. What are other forms of the language? In which sense speech as a form of the language can be considered? Traditionally, we believe that speech and language are the parts of communicative activity. I can't agree, that's the fourth, with the author talking about speech as exclusively the instrument of communication. In my opinion, the following phrase, where the main function of speech is psychological function, serves as a contradiction. So speech is not exclusively a means of communication. It controls certain internal processes. Maybe I misunderstood the idea of the author. 5. In the very beginning of the author says that taking into account the functional nature of pragmatic units and relatively low research previously conducted, it is interesting to analyze the correlation between the usage of such units in speech and the personal traits of the speaker, social and psychological ones. And my colleagues also mentioned the age specification and gender specification. Well, I don't believe that such a problem could be solved in one research paper, and the applicant chose one of the areas which is very important and interesting and may serve as the ground for future research. Well, I'm not sure if ambivert could be used as a different category, and how, first of all, should we identify this ambivert? It is a rather difficult way, and even if they possess certain medial qualities, they might remain introverts or extroverts in certain situations. So thus, certain specification characteristic of the speech of extroverts may be found in the speech of ambiverts, and vice versa. Thus, we can presume that certain extrovert and introvert specifications can be found in the speech of ambiverts. But I would also like to talk about the perspective of research. Will it be possible to use the social component might change the correlation of the pragmatic marker and the type of personality? As for the social status, will people belonging to the middle class and the higher social status use different pragmatisms? How evenly were the social types of personality were distributed according to their psychotypes? This is a topic for discussion, not as a negative aspect of work. And I'd like to conclude saying the following. The thesis by Gorbunova and Alexandrovna on the topic pragmatic markers of the Russian oral speech correlation with the speaker's psychotype correspond to the main requirements by the order of 1911-2021, number 11181/1, on awarding scientific degrees in Budapest State University. Applicant Gorbunova Daria Alexandrovna deserves being awarded scientific degree of candidate philological sciences, major 595, Russian language, the languages of peoples of Russian. Point 9 and 11 were not violated. Thank you very much for your attention, dear colleagues. Thank you, Vyacheslav Vasilievich, for your review. I also have a review and like to voice it as well, but I'll try not to repeat the information previously mentioned. When Natalia Viktorovna invited me to take part in the Dissertation Council, I was rather skeptical, because this idea of introverts and extroverts, in my opinion, was the most vulnerable element of analysis of the corpus one speech day. I doubted that this psychotypes that date back to Jung are still important, and these studies are constantly developing. And Natalia Viktorovna uses a specialist journal as a ground to talk about the development of this particular approach, and new data is also included. And I do hope that Daria Alexandrovna will send the results of her work to this magazine. And these magazines are important in criminal law and biology, and they have a high rating. Thus, the interest to such research is understandable. We also know that it is very uncommon task to evaluate the spontaneous speech. There was once a team of scientists talks about dreams, which decided to analyze the spontaneous speech and to make the groups out of teenagers with neurotic problems and without such. And this group did not succeed, and the research itself was conducted at a very high level, but the task wasn't solved. So it's very interesting that Daria Alexandrovna solved her task that she faced. And the success of such research lay in the idea that the hypothesis, the ground hypothesis, is found reliable. I will not mention all the positive aspects of the paper. One speech day corpus included the characteristics. One of uncommon results of the paper were the detailed description of the automatic system of data processing and calculation. This is the idea that belongs purely to the author of the thesis. This program developed by her might be used to analyze some other groups, maybe with some modifications.
Об этом все говорили уже, так или иначе затрагивали.
As for the topic of ambiverts, all my colleagues pondered upon it as well. A lot of reference material was used and analyzed. I found no gaps in the list of reference material. The independence of the work is exemplified by the fact that the structure of the work shows what the author herself wanted to demonstrate. Maybe the parts are not identical in their volume, but I'd like to say that I like the fact that the work is rather individualized, which unfortunately we find very often. And this work is unlike the papers in the group of Natalia Viktorovna, because I was afraid that I will start reading the same things that I have already read. And then here that everything is typical to the author only. The applicant participated in 12 conferences. And I would like to say that there is some discrepancy between what I said in the very beginning when I said about 4 works indexed in the Ministry of Education of Russia, and in total there are 16 works. The Dissertation Council takes into account only the publication belonging only to Daria Alexandrovna, but as a co-author she participated in a great number of publications, and they are indexed in Scopus and Web of Science. Most likely, maybe because of very strict rules of our Dissertation Council, not all the works were taken into account in the list of the documents. In reality, there are more publications than we initially stated. As any innovative work, thesis might lead to certain questions and hesitations. I have 4 questions. The first question is, to table 3, page 85. How did you calculate the number IP? Items per million. Where did you use million there? According to you, that the usage of pragmatic markers is about 20,000 or 11,000 groups of informants. That is, each word number 50 is a pragmatic marker. And is it true? The second, the classification of pragmatic markers does not allow to identify their functions. And you mentioned it yourself, that many of them combine several functions. I doubt the distinction of reforming markers from markers approximators. On page 34, you give the examples of reforming markers, according to the author, allowed to create the harmony of the rhythmic groups in the speech. It is also noted that the examples below are marked up according to isochromity of the fragments of the oral speech. And written markers form the following pattern of pauses. Approximative markers show the hesitation of the speaker. So to say, that is. My question is, how do you understand isochromic nature, and how can you functionally distinguish these type of markers? The third question. It is important to understand the data in tables 4 and 5, which have the quantity number of PM and their distribution in speech. Is important to analyze. And the analysis of table 4 shows that extroverts and introverts have more similarities than differences. The markers of hesitation, metacommunicatives, and so on are prevalent in both groups. And the entire spectrum of PM is used not only by extroverts, since the 3 types, the above-mentioned 3 types, are paramount, and the other types are rather low in their usage. The question is, are there any threshold figures, starting from which the share of a particular marker will be considered paramount or borderline. And the final question is related to the psychological types. If we talk in general, the share of ambiverts is about 50%, and according to your work, it does not exceed 8. Well, I understand that you took together clear and pure extroverts with the boundary cases, borderline cases. Can you please evaluate the results of such approach where you did not identify the majority of ambiverts? Nevertheless, despite these remarks, we can agree that the conclusions were novel and interesting, and the technical and methodological methods and the analysis of the new data make this paper a very important step to describe the speech characteristics of informants and groups of people speaking the Russian language. And the practical applicability is also very important. Alexandrovna, don't we take into account the speech specifications? We just don't do it explicitly. Well, I truly know that there are a number of words if a prospective employee uses, I will never employ the person. So the thesis by Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova corresponds to the major provision in accordance with the order of 1911-2021, number 11181/1, on the order of award in scientific degrees in Petersburg State University. The applicant Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova deserves being awarded the scientific degree of candidate of philological sciences, major 595 Russian languages of the peoples of Russia. Point 9 and 11 of the above-mentioned orders were not violated. Thank you very much. Daria Alexandrovna, now you can respond to all the questions. Dear members of the Decision Council, Maria Dmitryevna, Galina Mikhailovna, Yelena Nikitevna, Oksana Sergeyevna, Vyacheslav Isayevich, I want to thank you for your feedback, for your interest and your kindness, as well as for your very important questions, comments and remarks. And I'll try to answer your comments and remarks. At the request of Yelena Nikitevna, I would like to clarify the question of the material of my study and its representativeness. At the initial stage, 3,480 contexts were collected for analysis. However, in process of psychological and linguistic selection of material, 1,547 contexts were amended, and representativeness coefficient was quite high. As noted in the paper, the distribution of pragmatic markers by functional types was not uneven. The most frequent markers, these are hesitatives and delimiters, had a larger number of occurrences. For example, 385 contexts with the hesitative in extroverts and 283 in introverts, and the coefficient remained high. But in the case of low-frequency functional types of pragmatic markers, for example, there were only 2 contexts with a substitute marker for introverts and 6 for extroverts. The contexts were clearly not enough for generalizing conclusion. And the coefficient of representative coefficient would be very low. Maria Dmitrievna also asks about reliability of the research material, in particular about the methodology of calculating the frequency of pragmatic markers in IPM. The frequency in IPM was calculated as the difference between the number of occurrences and the volume of the corpus, that is, words, multiplied by 1 million. At the same time, the median value was taken as the number of occurrences, one pragmatic marker per one context, since all polyfunctional markers were previously grouped. And since statistical analysis was carried out after normalization of the material, and polyfunctional pragmatic markers were already identified and considered as two or more units, the numbers in the table are only partially correct. It would be more expedient to carry out such an analysis before normalization. So many thanks for the comment. Next time I'll take into account. Maria Dmitrievna also asks if there are any threshold values starting from which the share of some markers will be recognized as significant, and what is the proportion of borderline or multifunctional cases in these percentages. In my study, I focused on the median value for each of these psychotypes separately. That is 67 uses for introverts and 94 for extroverts. In the case of different material and different set of features under study, the figure would change. Since it was initially agreed in the study to consider polyfunctional cases as two or more units, I do not currently have data on multifunctionality and borderline, but they can be obtained and considered in the future. Further, Yelena Nikitina asks about ambiverts. Does the exclusion from the number of infants whose speech was analyzed violate the purity of the experiment? Marina Dmitrievna and Oksana Sergeyevna are also interested in how the inclusion of ambiverts in the total sampling would affect the results. I think that the purity of the experiment was preserved precisely due to the exclusion of ambiverts from the final sampling. One of the psychological tests, Viper questionnaire, does not contain the results for ambivert in its extroversion-introversion scale. Therefore, ambivert informants on the first test, EPI, simply could not be compared with anyone, since ambiverts on the second test, FPI, cannot be determined. This is not provided by the methodology itself. Galina Mikhailovna also asks a question of ambiverts, who is interested in whether my future plans include the study of characteristics of the oral speech of ambiverts, and whether it can be assumed that their speech will have a neutral, that's medium marked character, just like their psychotype. And is it possible to detect linguistic correlations of speech and this type of native speakers? So my answer is the following. The study of the characteristics of the oral speech of ambiverts is an interesting perspective in my research. However, it's very specific in terms of the selection of both material for analysis and methods for concluding the analysis. The number of ambiverts found in my study is not representative, as I have already mentioned, and the introversion-extroversion scale, as I said, does not make it possible to define an ambivert as a psychotype. Behind the psychological inclination of such speakers, most likely there is some typification of their speech, and it should be excluded, or we will have to base only on one test, which will be rather negative in terms of representativeness. Well, I can just guess that there is a certain typification of speech of ambiverts, but we need to research it. Elena Kentsevna also asks about the word so as a delimiting marker. Is not a function of this particle, regardless of the type of the speaker. The first example. So, look, you're in the middle of the major cabinet, and oak channels on the sides, here in stripes like that. So, well, I hope that everything fine. So, somehow you slammed it. So, yeah, fine. In response, I would like to say that it's difficult to distinguish and use the particle and pragmatic marker in oral speech. Most often such units go through multi-stage process. First, grammaticization from adverb into particle, and the dictionary gave these means as an element of polysemanticity of the unit. And later on, we can see the pragmatization process from a particle to pragmatic marker. It's impossible to draw a clear line between the uses. Particles are closest to pragmatic markers since they're often defined in dictionaries, not through semantics, but through function, which is very close to the pragmatics of a marker. In the above examples of the dictionary functions of the particles, so, conclusion for what we said earlier, entering an answer to question, strengthening, highlighting, confirming, the small academic dictionary 1988 is still not visible. Therefore, these uses were assigned to pragmatic markers. Secondly, the example shows that the speaker highlights the marker intonation, or using intonation, which is reflected by the transcriber in the form of pauses, shorter and longer ones. It's impossible to say unequivocally whether this kind of preparation can be a function of particular pragmatic marker inherited in the process of pragmatization, regardless of psychotype, which is why we do not consider each pragmatic marker separately, but only in the general class of delimiting markers. We should include the answer to the question of Vyacheslav Isayevich about the substitute marker. The sniper indecently shoots with this, optics and all this stuff. And all this stuff is difficult to determine its semantics without the context. Apart from the sub-dictionary meaning of its components, which exist exclusively in the context and implement a function, in this case a substitution function, we need to understand the PM is a functional derivative. Thus, metacognitive markers such as know, understand are used as meaning and introductory word when you pay attention to parts of a certain text. And know, you know, might be often used as introductory words. The complexity is not only the unambiguous distinction between pragmatic markers and part of speech, but also the functional distinction between PM groups. Maria Dmitrievna asks about the functional distinction between breath-forming markers and approximating markers. Under the isochronism in the work, we understand the existence of a relationship between the length of the speech unit and the speed of its pronunciation. Isochronism is an important factor that forms the integrity of syntagmas. In phrases consisting of several syntagmas, a change in the tempo of isochronism may occur in place of syntagmatic boundary, according to Shestinova, 2010. Thus, wreath-forming markers as a functional type are identified by auditory analysis tools, which, however, does not negate their polyfunctionality. The examples given are, well, listen somewhere, take these explosive substances, 9,000 about with pennies. PM might be a hesitative as well, while in the second example, when listening to the fragment, we unequivocally define it as a reforming one. At the request of Vyacheslav Isayevich, I would like to specify certain concepts. By discourse and oral discourse, I mean speech and speech communication, following under Alexandrovna Kubrick, or speech immersed in life, following Nina Davidovna Artunova. This approach to material is largely quantitative, since it involves not only registration of linguistic factors, but also the explanation from the point of view of cognitive processes in the head of the speaker.
В данном случае информанту ОРД.
The speech in my work is considered precisely as a form of existence of language. By speech we understand the process of speaking itself, or according to the definition of Alexandrovna, specific speaking, flowing in time and clothed in sound, or written form. And continuing to answer Vyacheslav Isayevich about the essence and functions of speech, I'll add the following. The main difficulty lies in the fact that the word speech is a phenomenon of material order. In contrast, mental phenomena belong to another category of phenomena, which do not have extension or are not extended over a period of time, are not measurable by physical means. Within the framework of modern psycholinguistics, one of the points of view perceives into speech processes as an integral part of the speech-language mechanisms and considers speech as a conductor of information, exclusively as a communication tool. Which is specified in the work by Tatiana Nikolaevna Ushakova, the appeal to speech manifestations, primarily to active speech production, shows that, in essence, active speech turns out to be a meaningful and expressive function aimed at bringing out the internal psychological states of the speaking person.
Если сущность мыслительного процесса в нахождении новых объектов, неизвестных отношений между ними, выявление их скрытых признаков и свойств, то функция
If the function is of the literal finding of new objects and unknown relation between them, revealing their hidden features or problems, then the function of generative speech is to attach the word to the newly formed mental product. This refers us to a complex and still unresolved problem of interaction between thinking and psyche, but its development was not included in the objectives of my research. The next question of the feasibility of formulating the state goal of the study arose with Alexandra Sergeyevna. Under individual characteristics of the speaker as opposed to general psychological, we mentioned gender, age, profession, and so on in the very beginning of the study. It was then in case the hypothesis about the presence of correlation with the psychotype is not confirmed, and additional characteristics will have to be included for analysis. When the formulated hypothesis was confirmed, these characteristics were not needed and were not used. But the purpose of the study was not adjusted. Many thanks to the remark. The following questions turn out to be common in the reviews of Vyacheslav Isayevich and Galina Mikhailovna. That's the question of the influence of speech, in particular use of pragmatic markers, not only influencing the psychotype of the speaker, but also their social characteristics, age, profession, and so on. Answering the question, I would say that gender, age, and other social characteristics of the speaker, of course, affect the number of pragmatic markers and their functional distribution. A lot of data is given in the works of the scientific team led by Natalia Viktorovna Beglarian. But my object of research includes studying only the influence of psychotype. And in the list of literature, I used my research all the works mentioned. Since the declaration has arisen outside some data of the kind published in a collective article literally in the summer of 2021, it turned out, for example, that the top 10 positions of the general frequency vocabulary of the PM were occupied by the following units. Here, there, yes, so, as it seems, then, you know, well, here, listen, says. Interestingly, this interesting distribution of pragmatic markers uses words almost completely, although not always the same, repeating the same sociolects. Exceptions, well, are present but very rare. So in the upper zone of the PM frequency list, in the speech of middle-aged native speakers, there are no context-established markers no and listen. In the speech of older speakers, the place of the marker listen was taken by the short verb understand, and in the speech of young people, a high rank of markers short and type is noticeable. An interesting practical question with Agba Galina Mikhailovna and Alexandra Sergeyevna. Does it make sense for employers who send personnel for position in which a person will have to talk a lot to take into account his or her psychotype? And is there such practice anywhere in the world? This issue has been actively discussed for decades, but the gap between scientific data and organizational practices that dealt with psychological assessment is still wide. For example, according to a survey conducted among thousands of HR managers representing large organizations in the United States, 68% of employers participate in various forms of performance testing. Only 29 of them use one or more forms of psychological measures. This data is consistent with other findings showing that less than 20% of US companies currently use psychological tests, and 82% of organizations do not use them in hiring or promotions. As for Russia, the percentage of employers offering psychological tests to candidates for positions is still very small. They carried out only by large companies such as Gazprom, Zerbank, Metro, and they use the psychological questionnaire, that is the factual questionnaire, from SHL, American company. And as a result of this test, the HR evaluates 32 factors based on 5 personality types. And a similar appraisal model is used in large managerial companies. For example, it was used at the most recent competition, the Leaders of Russia. And finally, the last question arose from Alexandra Sergeyevna. Can oral written speech of people with different temperaments have linguistic correlations, that is, sanguine, phlegmatic, melancholic, choleric? The result of my research is quite suitable for considering the issue. However, the psychological basis in this case will be weaker due to the inability to compare the results of several tests and unambiguously determine the type of temperament of the speaker. Since the selection of material was carried out after the selection criteria was established, no observations were made into the results. Once again, many thanks for the distinguished members of the Dissertation Council for interesting questions and your valuable comments. I will definitely try to use all your ideas and all your comments in my future work. As for normalization process, I didn't find any differences in my paper, but maybe it will be interesting for the next research. Once again, I'd like to thank the members of the Dissertation Council for your valuable questions and comments. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, are you satisfied with the answers provided by the applicant? Yes, all are satisfied, thank you. I'm satisfied as well. So we don't want to continue the discussion. Since everybody's satisfied with the answers, I need to ask those present in the hall if they have any questions or comments to the applicant. If none is willing, then I need to ask if we have received any questions via the live broadcast? None. Since there are no questions right now, I would like to give the floor to the scientific advisor. Natalia Viktorovna, the floor is yours. Do we need a technical break? The technical break, we announced the technical break 1? No? The technical break is over. Oksana Sergeyevna is here. So we move to the speech by Natalia Viktorovna. After Daria submitted documents to the scientific board, there were some long periods when I had nothing to do. I was voicing my final word, and I identified that I always say it differently because I have so many emotions. So I'm going to read according to my paper. And I will pronounce what was written long ago. So Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova studies at our university, starting from the master's level, and since then she became my student. Half a year before she decided to attend the master's program, she got into our section, and he was interested. She immediately became interested in our specialization. She came to us from Nizhny Novgorod, and master's degree and postgraduate studies took place here. And in all cases, I was the head and her supervisor. Within these 5 years of her life in St. Petersburg, Daria chose a very interesting and complex topic, which is rather innovative and pioneer in a way, not in linguistics in general, but in our scientific team as well. Dasha chose a niche and worked in this niche for 5 years and became an expert of correlation of speech in the psychotype. Not only me, but my colleagues and my postgraduate students who are present in here today know whom they need to address if they have any questions. And Dasha can allow data or specific data in response, or the method of analysis. The method of analysis was created by Daria herself, so she became the instrument that can be used further on, and her methods can be used for further analysis. Daria became the student. Daria became a colleague, a part of our scientific team, which conducted 3 projects within these 5 years. 3 projects supported by the Russian Scientific Foundation and the Russian Foundation for Fundamental Studies, and Daria participated in all these projects. She always worked with us, and now we are doing the project which we started last year, and we hope that it will last for 2 years more. And there she's a member of our scientific committee, and I don't think that we will be separated for a long time. We won't have the relationship of teacher and student, but we will continue working as colleagues for at least 2 more years, and then we'll see what happens. From all the above mentioned, you saw not only the defense of the work, but today we consider Daria Alexandrovna as a highly qualified linguist researcher of very high level and of a unique specialization. You have already mentioned about the reports and works published. Thank you, Maria Dmitrievna, that you pointed out the attention of a strange thing in the data of the academic board. Unfortunately, the academic board didn't take into consideration collective scopus and Daria non-academic works. Maybe the scientific board will take into consideration what we're saying right now, since all the other works are also important. Within these 5 years, Daria Alexandrovna is active and independent researcher with very high results. All 5 years, Daria was working rather intensively, and despite her work, she was doing exams and writing papers. It's rather difficult to imagine that a student might study and work at the same time. Well, nowadays, successful students can very well combine work and studies. I would like to say that within these 5 years, I envied myself that I have such a student, and I wish you, my dear students, to have such marvelous students. And if I have a problem, I call Daria, and she says that she always has time to help me and to assist me whenever necessary. Daria, thank you very much for your work, for our cooperation, and I wish you a magnificent future in all respects. Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalia Viktorovna. I suppose that it is pleasant for everyone to hear such things. Now, I'd like to ask you if there is anybody willing to have the floor among the members of the Decision Council or among those present at the Decision Council. It's your last opportunity to say something. Now or never. Including the remarks or objections to the procedure of the meeting. And here I need to ask all the members of the Decision Council, first of all those who are in the remote access mode. Oksana Sergeyevna, do you have any remarks or objections? No, the organization is brilliant, thank you. Vyacheslav Vaseyevich? No, everything is fine. Well, I wish I could be in St. Petersburg now, but at least like that. Maybe you'll be able to come to a March conference. Colleagues who are present in the hall? No, no remarks, no objections. I don't have any objections as well. Then we move to the next point of the procedure, that is voting. Is there a need prior to the voting procedure to have a break with muted sound for the broadcast? Since we all have pretty similar ideas and similar perception of the paper, I suppose that we can move directly into the voting procedure. Since we can see and hear each other very well, I'd like to discuss the issue of awarding the Alexandrovna Gorbunova the scientific degree of a candidate for philological studies 595 major languages of the people of Russia. I'd like to stress that if we vote for, it means that each member of the Dissertation Council agrees that the point 11 of the procedure was not violated, and point 11 is that the applicant in the research paper cites the author or the source of the reference material of the results. So we talk about plagiarism, and when using the results of scientific works performed with co-authors, the applicant is to identify this. We understand that this is not violated, and the decision of the Dissertation Council on awarding the scientific degree is considered positive if no fewer than 3 members of the Dissertation Council voted for it, according to the point 23 of the procedure. So I'd like to ask each of the members of the Dissertation Council about the opinion. Елена Иннокентьевна. Time. The time is 12 o'clock 15 minutes Moscow time. Елена Иннокентьевна, you need to answer in the mic. I vote for awarding the scientific degree to Daria Alexandrovna. Galina Mikhailovna. I vote for. Oksana Sergeyevna. I vote for. Vyacheslav Isaievich. I vote for as well. And I personally vote for. Thus, I would like to say, dear colleagues, that out of 5 members of the Dissertation Council, 5 members of the Dissertation Council voted for, against none, and nobody abstained from voting. Thus, we can say the decision on awarding Gorbunova Daria Alexandrovna the scientific degree of the candidate of philological sciences, scientific major 595, Russian language, the languages of the peoples of Russia, is adopted, and it is positive. We would like to congratulate you, and you have the floor for the final word. Dear colleagues, the members of the Dissertation Council, I'd like to thank all the members of the Council who took part in this work, and I would like to thank the head of the Dissertation Council, Voyikova Maria Dmitrievna, for profound comments that helped me to identify certain flaws and to have the further ground for research. I would also like to thank Elena Innokentivna, Galina Mikhailovna, Oksana Sergeyevna, and Vyacheslav Isaievich for the time that they spent reading my work and participating in the procedure of defense. This is a high value for me. I would also like to express my gratitude to my scientific advisor, Natalia Viktorovna Bogdanova-Beklarian, for her support and assistance at all the stages of the work. And she remains for me a role model which inspires me to become better. Natalia Viktorovna taught me not to doubt, to start using something new, and to shift the vector of my work, constantly expanding my horizons. And I'd also like to thank all the members of my seminars, which operate for many years under the under Natalia Viktorovna. A scientist is like an athlete, has to be courageous, to constantly train and create non-standard research. I would also like to thank the Methodist workers and all the workers in Petersburg State University for their help in organizing the process of the defense and preparing the documents. I would like to thank Savatina Diana Yurievna for advice when creating software for work. I'd like to thank all the members of my family for support. Especially I'd like to thank my father for expedient motivation. Finally, I would like to sincerely thank all people present in here for their time and attention to my paper. Thank you very much once again. I hope that in future my research will encounter such positive appraisal as well. Thank you. Thank you, Daria Alexandrovna. We have a small violation of the procedure. We received a comment later via email, and I would like to voice this comment as well. I'm reading the comment. Dear Maria Dmitrievna, dear members of the Dissertation Council, I don't have a question but a comment to the thesis by Daria Alexandrovna Gorbunova. I'd like to point out that the work conducted by the applicant on automatic processing of psychological typological is of high applicable value. And we in here are talking not only about the research of pragmatic markers, but about the research of spontaneous speech at all linguistic levels, phonetic, linguistic, pragmatic, and so on. As a member of the team of the scientists working on the corpus of One Speech Day, I'd like to thank her for using the questionnaires that have now become available to a large audience. I'd like to note the high competence of the applicant in the field of computer processing of linguistic data, and I wish her a successful professional career. Julia Shustinova, the Dean and the Head of the Educational Program Philology of St. Petersburg High School of Economics. Department of Mathematical Linguistics, St. Petersburg State University. Once again, thank you, and we'd like to congratulate you. And I suppose we can declare our meeting closed. Thank you all for your participation. Please turn off the live broadcast of the meeting.